This segment of the Chapter 13 lecture is titled The Emergence of Lincoln, and the focus question is, what enabled Lincoln to emerge as president from the divisive party politics of the 1850s? President James Buchanan, while a staunch defender of the Union, failed to settle the growing sectional tensions. He hoped that a Supreme Court case would finally resolve the slavery controversy. During the 1830s, Dred Scott, a Missouri slave, had accompanied his owner to both Illinois, where slavery was prohibited by the Northwest Ordinance and state law, and Wisconsin, where it was barred by the Missouri Compromise. After returning to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that residence on free soil had freed him. The Dred Scott decision was announced in March 1857, shortly after Buchanan was inaugurated. The court essentially divided 6-3. With Chief Justice Roger B. Taney speaking for the majority. Taney declared that only white persons could be citizens of the United States, since the founders believed blacks, quote, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote. According to Taney, blacks, having different ancestors and lacking a heritage of freedom, could never join the nation's political family. Taney and the court majority ruled that Scott remained a slave. They ruled that Illinois state law had no effect on Scott once he returned to Missouri, and that with regard to Wisconsin, Congress had no constitutional power to bar slavery from a territory. This effectively made the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, as was any law that interfered with Southerners' rights to bring slave property into the territories. The decision effectively made unconstitutional the Republican platform for restricting slavery and undermined the policy of popular sovereignty. If Congress could not prohibit slavery in a territory, how could a territorial legislature created by Congress do so? Perhaps the person least affected by the decision was the plaintiff himself, because a new master immediately emancipated him and his family. Scott died in 1858, while Harriet Scott lived until 1876, just long enough to see the decision overturned by Reconstruction amendments. Their youngest daughter died in 1954 at the age of 99 and lived through the segregation era and the birth of the modern civil rights movement. The impact of the decision was more far-reaching for the party system. The court itself suffered a significant blow to its reputation in the North, and rather than abandoning their opposition to slavery's expansion, Republicans viewed the court as controlled by the slave power. Buchanan announced that slavery now existed constitutionally in all territories, and his administration attempted to admit Kansas as a slave state under the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. Outraged, Douglas formed an alliance with congressional Republicans to block the attempt, and Kansas remained a territory until admission as a free state just before the Civil War. The Lecompton battle convinced Southerners they could not trust their most popular Northern leader. Americans' deepening divisions over slavery were captured in the Illinois senatorial election in 1858 between Stephen Douglas, the champion of popular sovereignty, and Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer of modest origins and a Whig who had served 4 terms in the state legislature and 1 term as a representative in Congress from 1847 to 1849. Lincoln re-entered national politics in 1854 as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. While Lincoln hated slavery, he was willing, unlike the abolitionists, to compromise with the South to preserve the Union. But he was adamant on halting the expansion of slavery. Lincoln's critique of slavery and its expansion articulated the basic values of the Republican Party and the millions of Northerners who voted for it. His life embodied the free labor ideology and the promise Northern society offered to workingmen. In 1850s Illinois, property-owning farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers vastly outnumbered wage earners. Though he stopped well short of arguing black equality entirely, Lincoln believed blacks should own their own labor and have the same opportunity as whites to improve themselves. The 1858 campaign against Douglas made Lincoln nationally known. Lincoln insisted that the nation would not survive forever half slave and half free, and that Americans would have to make a choice as a nation and reject the idea of popular sovereignty that Douglas advocated. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are classics of American political oratory. Conflicting definitions of freedom were at their center. Lincoln argued that freedom meant opposing slavery, and that the Founding Fathers had set the nation on the road to eventual abolition of slavery. Douglas argued that freedom resided in local self-government and self-determination, and that each locality had the right to determine its institutions. In the debates, Douglas tried to portray Lincoln as a dangerous radical whose positions would degrade white Americans by reducing them to equality with blacks. Douglas argued that the United States had been created by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever. Lincoln shared many of the racial prejudices of his day, opposed giving Illinois blacks the right to vote, and endorsed colonization. But Lincoln did not appeal to racism to gain votes, and he insisted that blacks were part of the human family, entitled to the same natural rights the Declaration of Independence offered to all men everywhere. Douglas was only narrowly re-elected to the U.S. Senate. Elsewhere in the North, many Republicans won elections. The attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, led by John Brown, also increased sectional tensions. Brown, a deeply religious man, had long been involved in anti-slavery activities. Highly influenced by the Old Testament of the Bible, Brown avenged an 1856 attack on Lawrence, Kansas by pro-slavery Southerners by murdering 5 pro-slavery settlers. In October 1859, Brown led an interracial group of nearly 24 men in the attack at Harper's Ferry. Brown and his men were soon surrounded, and all of them killed or captured by federal soldiers commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown faced a trial for treason and behaved admirably, earning through his trial the admiration of millions of Northerners, who nonetheless disapproved of his violent actions. Brown's execution made him a martyr of Northern abolitionists, while Northern praise for Brown outraged and further alienated Southerners. A growing number of Southerners began to think their region's future looked more favorable outside the Union than within it. Southerners had many complaints. The increasing price for slaves made it much harder for small farmers to become planters and thus economically independent. These secessionists argued that the North was benefiting from the cotton trade, while Southern planters fell deeper into debt. An independent South, they argued, could build a slave empire incorporating Cuba, other West Indian islands, Mexico, and parts of Central America. Some Southern planters openly called on the United States to buy or conquer Cuba to expand slavery, while other Southerners, like William Walker, led filibuster expeditions in which they tried and failed to capture Nicaragua and other parts of Central America in hopes of securing more territory for American slave owners. Some slave owners called for the reopening of the foreign slave trade. By early 1860, 7 Deep South states were demanding that the Democratic platform promise to protect slavery in all territories not yet made states. Virtually no Northern politician could accept that position, and Southern insistence upon it would end the Democratic Party as a national institution. Southern nationalists, known as fire eaters, hoped to split the party and the country to form an independent Southern Confederacy. When the Democratic Convention met in April 1860, Douglas's supporters commanded a majority, but not wide enough for his nomination. Because of Douglas's refusal to support forced slavery in all territories and his fight against the Lecompton Constitution, Deep South leaders now found him unacceptable. When the convention adopted a platform that reaffirmed popular sovereignty, delegates from the 7 slave states of the Lower South walked out, and the convention recessed in confusion. 6 weeks later, the convention met again and filled the vacant positions of those who walked out with Douglas supporters. Southern Democrats responded with their own ticket headed by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, who insisted that slavery must be protected in the Western territories. The Democratic Party, the last bond of national unity, was shattered. National conventions were traditionally places for reconciling differences, but in 1860 neither Northern nor Southern Democrats were interested in conciliation. Southern Democrats no longer trusted Northern Party members, and Douglas's backers refused to accept a platform they knew would bring defeat in the North. Republicans met in Chicago and nominated Lincoln, who initially had fewer delegates but did not suffer from William Seward's political liabilities. Seward had alienated former Know-Nothings as governor of New York. On the other hand, Lincoln appealed to moderates with his devotion to the Union, to abolitionists with his moral opposition to slavery, to immigrants, having never been associated with nativism, and in turn to former Know-Nothings who simply preferred him over Seward. Most important, he was from Illinois, and positioned to carry the pivotal doubtful states essential for Republican victory. The party platform denied the validity of the Dred Scott decision, reaffirmed opposition to slavery's expansion, and added economic planks to appeal to a broad array of Northern voters: free homesteads, a protective tariff, and government support for a transcontinental railroad. In effect, two presidential campaigns occurred in 1860. In the North, Lincoln faced off against Douglas. In the South, the Republicans had no support, and so three candidates ran against each other: Douglas, Breckinridge, and John Bell of Tennessee, the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, made of Unionist former Whigs who pledged only to preserve a constitution with existing protections for slavery and to prevent sectionalism. The election results were highly sectional. Lincoln won all the North except New Jersey, receiving 54% of the North's total votes, 40% of the national vote, and 180 electoral college votes, a clear majority. Breckinridge won most of the slave states, although Bell carried 3 Upper South states and about 40% of the South's total votes. Douglas was second in the popular vote behind Lincoln, but he was the only candidate with votes in all parts of the nation. But his failure to carry either section showed that a devotion to a union with slavery was no longer politically tenable. Lincoln was elected president without a majority of the national popular vote, though the North's larger population meant that he would have won the election even if all the votes of his 3 opponents had been cast for a single candidate.